Well, thank you, Richard, for that introduction, and thank you so much to the One Book program for hosting me here in Sarasota. Thanks to the Opera House for this great and very fitting chance to talk here, and thanks to you all for being here, book lovers, opera fans, and I hope, as you'll hear the importance of in a sec, I hope teachers out there, people who work with at-risk kids. That's such an important audience for this book and for Ryan, who I'm going to talk about this evening. It's a formal setting, but let's try a sort of overly sentimental exercise, an exercise I would object to if I were sitting where you are, as much too touchy-feely. But nevertheless, so if we can all picture a child or grandchild of ours, or picture yourself as a child around the age of 12. And now if we can take this one sentimental step further and close your eyes with that image, which I'll do too, which means that if you're, sort of scowling at me for even attempting this exercise, I won't know it, so go right ahead. But I'm going to close my eyes. Please do as well and sit with that image of that 12-year-old. Okay. So Ryan Speeder Green, the absolutely everything of the book I'm here to talk about tonight, grew up in southeastern Virginia, grew up in a trailer park and in low-income housing, and in a house that was really barely a house, more like a shack with bullet holes above his mother's bedroom window because the shack-like house was right across the street from a drug dealer's headquarters. And things were violent within Ryan's home, violent in all directions, violence emanating from his mother, from his father for the few years that his father was around, from his stepfather for the few years that that marriage lasted, from Ryan's older brother, from Ryan himself. And when Ryan was 12, he threatened his mother's and his older brother's life, threatened them with a knife and with a very vivid drawing of what he intended to do. And in handcuffs and in leg shackles, he was driven in a police car across the state, so beginning in southeastern Virginia, all the way across the state to near the West Virginia border, to Virginia's juvenile institution of last resort. And there he lashed out at everyone around him, at the staff, at other kids. And he was placed in isolation. And within days of his arrival, this was the scene. "I'm going to kill you," he announced to a tall black girl who reminded him of his mother. "I'm going to rip your fucking face off." He warned that he would do the same to the staff. "You're doing this to me. You're the fucking reason," he told them. They pinned his arms behind his back. They shut him in one of the seclusion cells. There was nothing. The cinder block walls were off-white. The linoleum floor was a watery blue. The cell throbbed, fast, loud pulses of sound from an air vent above. The rhythmic noise encased him, invaded him, vibrated inside his skull. "Why do they think you're so evil? Why are you so evil?" He gazed through a slit of glass in the door. It gave him only glimpses. Staff were smiling. A kid was smiling. He couldn't hear them, but knew they were laughing. He lay on his belly on the tiles. "Get me out of here," he howled into the gap at the base of the door. "Get me out of here." He stood, pounded on the door, pounding, pounding. "I'm gonna kill you, white bitch," he shrieked at a nurse. "Racist," he accused. "Hawaiian bitch. I am perfectly fucking calm. I want the fuck out. I promise I will kill each and every one of you." "12 years later, in New York, when he was 24, I met this radiant human being. And here is Ryan Speedo Green a year ago when he was preparing to sing his first major role at the Metropolitan Opera in La Boheme. The song comes near the end of the opera, and at that point, it's near the climactic moments. And for the small group of characters who live as bohemians in Paris in the 19th century, dreams of both love and artistic success are dying. But if you're not an opera fan, if you don't know the story, it doesn't really matter. All that matters for now is Ryan's voice. So the morning after opening night, the New York Times called Speedo's performance a showstopper. And through Speedo's story, and he does much prefer, in fact, insists on being called Speedo, so that's what I'm going to do henceforth. I'm going to talk about the possibilities, the layers that exist within us. Speedo's story is a story about the invention or reinvention of self. It's a story about educators, about faith, about art. And I think it's a story about where we Americans are right now when it comes to race. But let's go way back to Speedo as a child. When he was between the ages of 9 and 11, he was placed in a special classroom, a classroom for the most out-of-control elementary schoolers in his entire school district. And there he had a teacher named Mrs. Hughes. And Mrs. Hughes, picture a pint-sized woman, she's Irish-Italian, a pint-sized woman with a pile of blonde tinted curls atop her head. And on Speedo's first day in her class, he threw his desk at her and told her that he would not learn from any white woman. He expected to have him taken away. In fact, when he was 8, and Speedo really, made an impression on people when he was a kid. When I called his principal from the school he'd been at before getting sent to Mrs. Hughes' classroom, decade more later, she remembered Speedo right away. I mean, this was a kid who really no one could forget the kind of violence he was capable of even then, the troubled soul that he was at that point. And in any case, the year before he'd gone to Mrs. Hughes' classroom at the age of 8, he had in fact had the experience of, after an eruption class, he was left in the classroom. All the other kids were cleared out for their safety till he could be escorted away. But Mrs. Hughes did something he did not expect. She looked back at him. She said, "Since your desk is now on the floor, you can learn from the floor until you're ready to do otherwise." And that was Mrs. Hughes. She, little and really, picture tiny as she is, she both refused to be cowed, but also refused to be told about the records, the histories of the students being sent to her. She all but covered her ears when teachers tried to share their trials, what they had been through, with the kids she was now being given. And if you visit her today, you'll see in her living room 3 monkey statuettes. One, hands over ears, eyes, mouth, right? Kind of representing that mantra of hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil. That is Mrs. Hughes. She had infinite, though far from naive, faith in kids' ability to recreate themselves. She made her students memorize parts of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, not only because she wanted to try at least to bridge the distance between herself as a white woman and her students, who were mostly black, but also because of that phrase, content of their character. She wanted her students to know that their histories did not matter to her. They were going to be able to define themselves by who they decided to be with her. She knew that not all of her students were going to be able to transform themselves. She knew that maybe not even half, not even a third of her kids would be able to pull themselves away from who they had already been. But Speedo thrived. And he had a kind of revelation. And the revelation was simple, or I suppose sounds simple to most of us, but it wasn't simple to him, and that was that he could read. He could really, really read. He stayed up late at night all of a sudden reading the Narnia books, reading about those kids who pushed through the back of the wardrobe, if I'm remembering my childhood reading correctly, and enter an entirely other world. So he had this transformation, or nascent transformation, but he still had episodes of fury that included outbursts in Mrs. Hughes's room. And after those, he would write her letters. One of the great things for me as a writer is that Mrs. Hughes saves everything. She has an entire room in her house devoted to teaching memorabilia. So I spend lots of time at her house just going through the history of Mrs. Hughes as a teacher. There's so much stuff. There was stuff I finally just couldn't include in the book. But I'm going to veer off, and because I'm remembering something now. You know, it was like she was born to teach, because as a very little kid, she would set up these elaborate classrooms with her stuffed animals, and she would teach them, and she'd have report cards for them, and just, you know, every little detail, even as a child, it was as though she was anticipating this calling that she would later live out. Anyway, I'm going to read you one of these letters that Speedo wrote to her in apology, and it includes on the page all of his misspellings. You just need to understand one. So the second time he writes the word heart, H-E-A-R-T, he means hurt, H-U-R-T. Dear Mrs. Hughes, I made a great fool of myself. I admit I did yell at him. I haven't been starting the day right. Even though I am sitting in this seat, I am lessening. I will try to start over. I see how better everyone would be when I'm not here. People say life would be better without Ryan. And now I know they are telling the truth. You may think I am mean-hearted, but I'm not. I don't want to heart anyone. I've always said I could work on it, but it just happens again. Thank you for not giving up on me, because it shows me I can do it if I try. Your student, Ryan. Just to dwell for a sec, as I still do when I read that letter, on how much of the violence that had come his way, the criticism that had come his way, the denigration that had come his way, to be a kid who would say, you know, I know the world would be a better place without Ryan. And by 12, Speedo was out of Mrs. Hughes's class, but at 12, he was being driven across the state in shackles and locked up. Mrs. Hughes found out where he was and called him at the facility, and he listened to her reassurances for as long as he could bear to hear her voice, for a minute or two, and then hung up and sobbed. At the facility, most of the staff were worn down. Some were seriously injured by the mix of criminal and psychiatric cases who were locked up there. Priscilla Jenkins was the Hawaiian bitch Speedo railed at. Actually, as I would learn, Priscilla Jenkins is Cuban and prided herself, as she told me, on the relentless Cuban hugs she would give out. With me, years later, Speedo would recall those hugs clearly, even if her ethnicity was a muddle. And he would also recall that regularly, even after his aggression toward this woman, Priscilla, landed him in isolation, she would find ways to give him a few extra points on his behavior chart so that he would then earn the privilege to play this kind of simple video game where he would fly this sort of cartoonish propeller plane across this crystalline blue sky. And he told me that was the lowest time in my life, but there was this one woman there at the center. And he could still recall the system of behavior points that he continually failed to succeed at, so that you would accrue points for everything from brushing your teeth, which many of the kids were incapable of doing on a regular basis anyway, to, you know, being quiet, whatever it was. And you can imagine, Speedo would slowly climb. He was capable of brushing his teeth, but, you know, he would act out violently and come crashing down. All the points would be taken away for his infractions, but Priscilla would, you know, enhance his chart just a little bit so he could at least play this game where he would fly this plane through this perfect blue sky. And I promised Speedo I would find this woman because he had never forgotten her faith in him. Now, you'd be right to wonder, how can this writer possibly know what life was like for Speedo when he was locked up at the age of 12? A 12-year-old's memories are not all that reliable. You'd be right to wonder, too, how can this white writer know much of anything about what life was like or is like for Speedo, since Speedo is African American? But before I try to answer those complicated questions, let me answer one that's more basic. How did I get to know Speedo in the first place? So, back in 2010, I was covering the Metropolitan Opera's annual contest to find the most promising singers in North America, promising young singers between the ages of 20 and 30. And how I got to do that is because my daughter, fairly late in high school, discovered she had something of an operatic voice, was about to apply to conservatories. I, proud dad that I am, loved to just sort of sit on the couch, listen to her sing, and of course, being a dad, liked to dispense some advice, but this advice was based on next to nothing. So I really realized when she was going to go off to conservatory, I need to learn something about opera. I had the most minimal background from listening a bit as a kid. And so asked the editors at the magazine if I could follow this contest. They were enthusiastic. I began in the district rounds in both big cities and tiny places around America, and followed the contest as it progressed toward the semifinals at the Met in New York. Once the 22 semifinalists were chosen, I got their emails and I sent out messages saying, write me something about yourselves, your love of music, your connection to music, how you grew up, anything. And I got back responses, some of them very lengthy from everyone, and understandably lengthy because this was a chance to just maybe get featured in the New York Times Magazine. But to be precise, I got responses from every single singer except Ryan Speedo Green. And that sounds unlikely, but it's absolutely true. It sounds so unlikely that I sometimes doubt it, and I go back and check my printouts of those responses, and indeed there are 21 responses, and Ryan's is the one that's missing. And then when they got to New York and I got to the Met, and so everyone converged, and I was hanging around, you know, it was easy to find, or singers were finding me, sitting down to chat. That was true for all the singers except Ryan Speedo Green. He did not believe he had a story to tell, did not believe he had anything to say. So we, got to know each other gradually, I'd say, and part of that gradual pace was not only because he didn't think he had a story to tell, but also, I should explain, because he had a different relationship to the past and different assumptions about the past than some of us might have. I think the psychotherapeutically minded or influenced among us may believe some version of, if you dig down into your past, it'll liberate you, it'll strengthen you to understand it, to talk about it, to unbury it, will make you a better person. But to Speedo, digging down into the past was a danger. It could suck you back. It was better to leave it buried. So we established this kind of incremental pace. We traveled slowly back into his history, and further back than that. On his mother's side of the family, his roots ran deep in southeastern Virginia, where America's beginnings seem almost literally to speak from the soil. There's the founding of the settlement of Jamestown. There's the embrace of slavery on the colony's tobacco plantations. There's the British surrender at Yorktown. And in a country churchyard, I found the gravestones of Speedo's family from just a couple of generations back, except that they weren't gravestones. They were these thin bits of metal, much like license plates, staked into the ground, which is what his family could afford. The answer about how I got to know in detail about his life at the facility is one of just journalistic persistence and then luck. I was able to find Priscilla and others who worked there. I found kids who spent time there. First, I actually had to find the facility itself because Speedo and his mom both had so shut down about the past that they weren't sure actually where he'd been sent when he'd been driven off in that police car. And I went to various magistrates and burrowed into what records existed and sleuthed and mostly was getting nowhere until I happened to remember that a brother of a close friend of mine worked as a juvenile defender in Virginia, He sort of listened to this whole story, said, why don't you try this place, Stanton? And in fact, that's where Speedo was locked up. Stanton is the town where the facility is in Western Virginia. And the current director was really helpful and said, you know, yes, it was here, the records are still here. You know, if you just put in a request with Ryan, we will send you everything we have. We did that. And one day I remember Speedo and I were to meet near the Met. And he showed up with this box of 500 or 600 pages of material and said, I cannot deal with this. You read it. You can ask me whatever you want. And it turned out that the facility had kept an every 15-minute log of his time there. So that's largely how I was able to begin to recreate his experience. And that record, those 500 or 600 pages, raised for Speedo the most profound and troubling questions. Am I still that person? Is that person still inside me? And of course, I had those same questions, but I also had one that trusted he was not that same person, yet that led to, how did you get from there to here, from that person to this? And I remember once Speedo and I were in his not very glamorous apartment, and we were hanging out on his sort of torn leather-wrapped couch, and he just stretched out on the couch as though I were his psychoanalyst and said, that is what we're going to spend the next few years finding out. But now, who were we, Speedo and I? In lots of ways, total opposites. He stands 6'5". I stand 5'10", and I like to tell my girlfriend I'm really 5'11", but that's just not true. 5'10" and 3/8, probably 5'10" and 1/4, which he referred to all through our early years of talking as tiny until probably the 50th time I said, Speedo, I am not tiny. And I don't know, he probably still thinks of me as tiny, but anyway, he's kindly deferred to my deluded judgment on that. I'm the child of an intact family. He of a broken home. I grew up in a comfortable house. He grew up in the places that I've alluded to, that shack-like house, that low-income housing. And he's black and I'm white. What does a writer of nonfiction do to cross boundaries? And finally, can the boundary of race be crossed by a white writer without diminishing the essence of that person's life, without committing a kind of crime, the crime of appropriation, in a way stealing another person's experience, a vulnerable person's life? You know, when I first started writing, these kinds of questions weren't even being asked, and now, of course, they're heavily in the air. It's easy to talk about the process of trying to cross that boundary, and that's just asking and listening and transcribing, and thus listening again and imagining and asking and listening again and again and again. Same question over and over from different angles, just to make sure I've got it right, but also to hear everything that's inside. But given all that, still, is the attempt to write across racial lines valid at all? We're taught nowadays that it might not be. And I think we should, no matter who we are, question ourselves hard about the perspectives we bring, the limitations we bring to understanding each other. I've been questioning myself along these lines for a long time. The first nonfiction book I wrote, God of the Rodeo, is about Louisiana's Angola prison, where about 75 or 80% of the convicts locked up there are African American. Second nonfiction book, In the Land of Magic Soldiers, was about a civil war in Sierra Leone in West Africa. So it's about a small group of Sierra Leoneans, but also about a white missionary family from Michigan who'd really gone to live in this very remote Sierra Leonean village. And so much of it was about that interaction. So I've been immersed in this question for a long, long time, asking myself, both privately and sometimes right on the page, about the validity of this effort and about the kind of walls that our subjectivity creates around us. And yet, at the same time, I think we'd better not. I think we'd better never quit trying to imagine ourselves across the boundaries that exist between us. When Speedo got out of the facility, he wanted desperately to separate himself from where he'd been. He wanted never to go back to that place. And he wanted to put distance between himself now and who he'd been. But how? Besides the faith offered him by Mrs. Hughes, by Priscilla Jenkins, what did he have to go on? At that point, coming home to the trailer park, his life could have gone worse than nowhere. His stepbrother is now serving his third sentence in prison for drug dealing, for gun possession, for gang activity. And his older brother, his full brother, Adrian, who's a talented artist, by the way, has served time himself, and the last I visited him was living precariously on couches at the edge of the Mojave Desert. But for Speedo, luck and art and sheer will intervened. This is an intricate part of the story, but what's important to know for the moment is, as a young teenager, Speedo was not a singer. And I know that listening to that recording of him singing from La Boheme, that's hard to believe, but there was no sign of Speedo's having a monumental or even a significant talent at that time. This was so bewildering to my editor, who I love, that she insisted I go back and talk one more time to all the people who knew him back then and who knew him as he started to study just a little bit, to make sure this was right. And indeed, they absolutely confirmed that was right. And another thing, I think there'll naturally be people in this room who assume, well, at least he must have sung in his church choir, right? You know, every African-American kid grows up singing initially in the church choir. It's a stereotype. It's not an off-base stereotype, but it does not apply to Ryan Speedo Green. He did not grow up singing gospel in his church choir. What happened was this, that circumstances led him or kind of forced him to do a perfunctory audition for this half-day School of the Arts in Norfolk, Virginia. And he just got through the Star-Spangled Banner a cappella, got through it not particularly well, but two things. One, the school's mandate was to take a certain number of students from each area, and they were not getting a whole lot of classical singers from Speedo's area, so he had that advantage. But the bigger advantage, total serendipity, Mrs. Hughes' husband is a school administrator. And by that time, Mrs. Hughes' husband had become the principal at this School of the Arts. It's important to picture Mrs. Hughes' husband, Leon. He has a kind of matching set of gold-tinted curls. And so the two of them form this pair of fairy tale-like figures. And Mr. Hughes placed his finger on the admissions scale. Speedo could not read music. I mean that absolutely literally. Ear training for him, I sometimes compare to trying to hear a dog whistle as a human being. He could no more identify a note played by his teacher on the piano than we could hear those sounds that dogs register and respond to. Was that a G? Was that an A? Was that an E natural? What is a natural note? None of it was he versed in. He was completely at a loss. And all the while, at home, the violence went on. His mother's boyfriend at the time was disciplining him with stomach punches. So he was about to be kicked out of that arts program at the end of his first year. But if Speedo were here tonight, he would want us to recognize, above all, two people, Mrs. Hughes and Mr. Brown. He would want us to pay tribute to all that a teacher can mean for a child. I got to dedicate this book. I dedicated it to my children who kind of saved my life in a way. Had it been Speedo's to dedicate it, he certainly would have dedicated it to Mrs. Hughes and to Mr. Brown, who saved him. Mr. Brown, picture a towering African-American man, a voice teacher at the School of the Arts. He stood taller than Speedo was at the time, and remember, Speedo was well on his way to the 6'5" and 300 pounds that he stands today. And Mr. Brown refused to let Speedo fail. He insisted on tutoring him late. He insisted on driving him home to the trailer park, 45 minutes one way, 45 minutes back, after they spent those late afternoons and evenings together. He insisted on buying him clothes. He insisted on mediating whenever things got rough at home with his mother. He became a kind of father figure for Speedo, because Speedo saw his father only a handful of times while he was growing up. And then Mr. Brown took a group of his students to New York to see an opera, to see Carmen at the Met. This was Speedo's first opera. Until then, as Speedo says, his idea of opera was primarily this big fat white lady in a Viking helmet shrieking and breaking glass. And thus, Speedo arrived at the Met. And there, I think many of you have seen it or just picture it now. So crossing the plaza with that grand fountain, approaching those giant glass windows behind which there are huge Chagall murals, entering into a world of chandeliers and grand curving staircases and crimson carpeting, and then sitting down to Carmen. And that night, to Carmen being sung by an African-American mezzo-soprano, Denise Graves, and sung beautifully. I believe that performance, or one within a few days of it, is still up on the Met website. Sung beautifully by a woman who's also quite stunningly beautiful, and Speedo was smitten. He was swept away. And it turned out that from the DC area, from his own local singing, Mr. Brown knew just a little bit Denise Graves and took his students backstage. And Denise Graves singled out Speedo for a hug. And so they're crossing back across that plaza, and Speedo angles up to Mr. Brown and says, "I am going to sing at the Met." And I think Mr. Brown laughed and then told him the endless list of things he'd have to do before he could even think about such a dream. There's so much to tell about Speedo's devotion and about all the devotion that led from that moment to this. And I'm going to leave those scenes of determination for the book or for your questions afterward, which I very much look forward to. But I want to make it clear that when Speedo and I first met, he was maybe 1/3 of the way along the artistic journey to where he is today. He'd made it through 2 mid-level conservatories. The other semi-finalists had gone to places like Juilliard or Curtis. He was scratching out a living at the time. He was with a small troupe that would drive around to Colorado mountain towns, singing abridged operas at schools and community centers. And when I didn't get that email from Speedo as the semifinals were approaching, I didn't think a thing of it because no one at the Met had said to me, you should really listen and watch for Ryan Speedo Green. He's a likely winner. He's got such a great voice. No, none of that. There was no anticipation in particular about Speedo. His craft was so crude in an art that values craft to an extreme level. He sang everything forte at the top volume, even when Mozart specified the softness of pianissimo. He was crippled by what he didn't know technically. But he had a charisma on stage. He had a need, a drive to be heard. And there were several things behind that drive. Just before the semis, he managed to reach his father across the country by phone in Bakersfield, California. And he tried to explain to his father what this contest meant to him and how big a deal it really was. And his father promised that if Speedo somehow got himself to the finals, that his father would somehow get himself across the country to hear him sing opera for the first time. Now remember, Speedo didn't really think he had a chance. In fact, the finals are a formal concert in front of a packed house at the Met, and he hadn't even brought his tuxedo to New York. That's how much he didn't believe in his chances, but his father had made this promise to him, and I think you'll hear a little bit of what that meant to Speedo in these few paragraphs that I'll read. All you really have to know to understand this moment is Adrian is Speedo's older brother, and that their father was once an amateur bodybuilder and claimed that once he'd met Arnold Schwarzenegger. Ryan couldn't tell Adrian about making the finals because at that point he didn't know how to reach him. His brother had been released from prison not long ago. He was living on the streets, or at best on couches, somewhere in California, probably. He had a 7-year-old son he hadn't seen in several years, not only because he'd spent 2 of those years locked away, but because his ex-wife had a restraining order against him. Ryan and Adrian had exchanged vows when they were kids. Vows spoken after Ryan burrowed into his brother's chest while the chaos of their mother's second marriage consumed the flimsy walls and floors, traveling through the house to swallow them. Vows, Ryan said, that we would never be like that, and that when we grew up, we would never hit a woman. At birthdays and Christmases, they made another set of pledges to each other. We swore we wouldn't forget about our children. They had made a habit as kids of teaming up to steal action figurines from a discount store. One of them stood watch in the aisle while the other took from the shelves. They collected the pliable superheroes, hyper-muscled and heavily armed with rocket launchers and mega machine guns. They took Schwarzenegger more than once, took him in several of his roles, carried his spectacular body and his bravery home, knowing that their father had once shaken his hand, knowing that their father loved him. They stole him again and again, like stealing their father back into their lives, and kept him in their bedroom. Something else, too, was driving Ryan Speedo Green, the singer, and that was the transcendence of race. This drive, I think, had its source in King's speech that he'd memorized so many years earlier with Mrs. Hughes. He wanted to be, he told me, a small part of King's dream. Singing opera was in no way a denial of being African American. Speedo is proudly, he is fiercely African American. But what he wanted was to be heard. He wanted the beauty and power of his singing, unadorned, remember, by any amplification, because you know this. No amplification in opera hall. It's pure voice. It's that combination of power and nuance that is so extraordinarily difficult to achieve. He wanted that from within him to supersede everything else. He wanted the beauty and power of his singing to make race immaterial. Like the other parts of Speedo's story, this one's about reinvention. The reinvention that we will all have to find our way toward as a country. All of us. No matter our politics, no matter our color. Speedo's is not a simple story. It's not a Jackie Robinson story. The Met stage was integrated, like baseball was back in the 1950s. Speedo's is a complicated story fitting for our complicated times. It is about redefining identity. It's about recasting how we perceive each other. It's about redrawing the boundaries of possibility. Now, when Speedo first embraced opera, these scenes repeated themselves over and over. On the morning school bus, and remember he went to regular school in the morning before going off to the School of the Arts in the afternoon. On the morning school bus, his classmates would mock him. They'd grab the scores of music out of his hands and torment him for singing white people's music. Meanwhile, from back then, really till now, after he sung in an opera or performed in a recital, white audience members will almost invariably come up to him afterward and say, "Oh, you should really sing Old Man River like Paul Robeson did in Showboat." Now, you know this. Old Man River is an anthem of resignation sung by a physically strong but oppressed and pitiable black character in the Jim Crow South, and it's sung in a heavy black dialect. It's a beautiful piece of music, but it has almost nothing to do with Speedo's musical dreams. I want to close with this bit of a scene. It happens at a party thrown by a very wealthy Met patron. It's a sought-after party. Everyone wants to be invited. Certainly the young singers want to be invited. Picture a gorgeous Manhattan apartment, vaulted ceilings hanging from those double-height walls are these century-old tapestries. And Speedo stands at the piano. He's sung one song, and that's kind of an obligation for any singer who enters the room. But he's actually avoided the party the previous year, despite being invited, because he dreads the moment when he's going to be asked, as he anticipates being asked, to sing Old Man River. And he's sung his one song. He wants nothing more than to get to the door before anything further can happen. But he's sort of stranded there for a moment, and people are begging for an encore. The pianist suggested Old Man River, proposed it heartily, his voice ringing out. The hostess and host and their guests, a celebrated Met tenor among them, formed a white chorus. Yes, Old Man River, sing Old Man River. He was surely alone at that moment. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be heard. And here he was in a room packed with well-meaning people who did not see him, who perhaps were incapable of seeing him, who possibly refuse to see him and who are eager to have him inhabit an object of pity, to hear him be that pitiable object with every note that rose from behind his ribs and from within his throat, to gather around the big, brawny black man and listen to him lament his oppressed and thwarted and minuscule life. I am the epitome, he'd said to me in the months before that party, of don't judge a book by its cover. Everything I did when I was younger, everything I was around, everything I was, gave you only a cover to look at. I was another number, another statistic. I was a stereotype, another kid going worse than nowhere. And I was only seeing the cover. A few people were trying to read the book, and then I started to read it and started to create new chapters in it. But earlier, the cover was what I was looking at. Okay, so now we're, spoiler alert if you haven't read the book, this is a really devastating moment. You know, Speedo was willing to go everywhere with me in terms of his past, but that was a moment that he only really wanted to talk about once, and I couldn't bear. Maybe I brought it up a second time, but I really couldn't bear to dwell there. It was just too painful. So I don't know the answer to that question. I don't think he interpreted it as coming from a place of malice. And I know to this day he clings to the belief that, you know, the man he thought of as his father was in fact his father. And that in itself is telling. That's all I really needed to know, was that the power of that clinging is the meaning. It's all there. Yeah.
It's really a two-part question. All the horrible, horrendous things you told us about his growing up in his life, how does he feel today about being in the public eye, having so many people know about him? Is he feeling relieved, grateful? He wants other people to learn from him. What's his philosophy on that as far as you bringing up all those things? Number one.
Yeah,
Number two. Number two, they kind of go together. How often are you still in contact with him? How often do you guys talk?
Okay, so the second one's easy. Very often we just had dinner on Tuesday or Wednesday night. And it was a very grand, long dinner because Speedo really likes to eat. We can talk about that in detail in a second. But the more searching question, I think Speedo's really proud to have his story out there. You know, when I gave him the book before it came out, he had very, very few, teeny tiny corrections to make. He wants this book to inspire kids who are like him. We've been back to the facility where he was locked up. I've been back 3 times. He's been back twice. He's about to go back a 3rd time next month to sing for the kids, to reach out to the kids. He's done other events with at-risk kids. And the other thing he really, 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 if I haven't made this clear, wants to stress is just to give faith to teachers who are out there whose lives are not always so easy with the kids they're working with. And he wants them to know that you can make, to say you're making a difference is just a wild understatement. You know, to read this book is to know that you are imbuing kids with something they may not, they may not gain strength from right away, but it's going to build within them as it did with Speedo. So that his transformation was not immediate. He was locked up almost immediately after spending time with Mrs. Hughes, and yet her influence persists. She's still in his life. They've seen him at the Met. You know, I'm still in touch with them too. You know, she and Mr. Hughes are still like fairy godparents to him, and he really wants that known. Yeah. And again, I can't always see everyone who's back there, so I'll have to let you help me in microphone direction. And I definitely want to get to everyone.
I was really upset by the mother's behavior. And did she ever really understand the damage that she had done to her son? Because he learned from her how to pull a knife on someone. I mean, he saw her and pull a knife on Cecil, and he pulled the knife on her. Did she ever really understand the damage that she had done to her son?
Well, first, thanks. You're a very close reader, because, yeah, there is that connection, although I don't dwell on it on the page. So let me say one thing in Valerie's defense for a sec, and then I really will answer your question candidly. So sometimes I think mothers get a little bit of a bad rap. They're the ones who are right there. Speedo's father was gone, and so it's easy to idealize him. Valerie was there, extremely flawed, but she was there. And so I think what Speedo would say is, one thing he got from his mother, despite all the horrors of growing up, was a kind of will, a determination, partly born of what he'd had to endure because of her, but partly because she herself is a woman of kind of indomitable will. You'd get that sense if she were here today. I think your question calls for what's their relationship now? Has there been a mending? Has she apologized? It's a work in progress. I think Speedo and she, I hope that it'll be a relationship that heals with time, but I'm not going to be Pollyannish. It's not a relationship that's fully healed. And I think one of the processes he went through with me over those sort of 4 or 5 years that we were spending tons of time together was to go from blaming himself for everything and wanting to sing for her forgiveness to feeling like maybe she might be the one who at least equally should be asking his forgiveness. And so I think there's still a journey to go there.
My question to you would be, what kind of a relationship does Speedy have with his black contemporaries? Are they aware of his gift now and of the tremendous things he's done?
Interesting. So you mean his contemporaries from when he was a kid?
Or the young black people in general, with whom he might come into contact?
Right. Well, I think now there's been a great response. So sometimes, just a few weeks ago, I was at a party talking to several African-American guests, and the minute I mentioned the book, they were like, oh yes, Ryan Speedo Green, the opera singer. So I think there's been a kind of embrace more generally than just in the opera world. But I hope that Speedo's story begins to forge a new, wider set of definitions and a wider, more encompassing idea of identity. I think that he hopes that as well. So again, I don't think there's an easy answer to that question, but I hope his artistry makes a kind of statement in response to what you're asking.
Are he and August still going strong? And are they in fact married?
Irena, you mean? Yeah. So are he and Irena still married? They are indeed, and they just a few months ago had their first child, who's incredibly adorable. So yes, they are.
And the second question is, I asked you earlier if you had any new projects in the works, and you said ask the question.
Oh, I did? I guess I put myself on the spot then. Yeah, I do. I've just turned in a book that's quite a departure in two ways. One, although it tells a story, it's less of a single character, sort of driven narrative like this one is. And then, big departure, it's a collaboration. So I've teamed up with an African-American economist at Harvard who's got a pretty big name for himself in his field. His name is Roland Fryer. Clarification, most people when they hear economists think of sort of abstruse financial matters. It's not really accurate. Economists do very rigorous research about all kinds of things, in this case education, criminal justice, income inequities, etc. And so Roland and I have teamed up to write this book, I hope with some original things to say, some things that aren't being said in the conversation right now about how to narrow some of the racial gaps that exist in America. So the book will be out in about a year. Yeah.
My question begins with you as an author of being very brave, but also very bold to challenge yourself to do all this research. What did you have to do legally to protect yourself so that you were able to do all this research without later having somebody sue you, namely Speedo?
Well, no. Speedo, I don't think would ever sue me. I mean, we've really, the process is so intimate, and it's probably so unlike what you might picture from movies about journalists where everyone's hard driving, they're daily newspaper writers, they're going to get that scoop, they're going to get that quotation, they're going to uncover, the scandal. That's just not what I do. I came to writing first as a novelist. The first book I published was a novel. I then stumbled into this because I'd been living in Louisiana. I'd heard about this convict rodeo that Louisiana's maximum security penitentiary has every year. Now it's kind of famous, but then no one had written about it. And I went as just a spectator, and I was so blown away by it. The prison is off in the middle of nowhere. Almost all the inmates are there for life, no chance of parole. Florida may be similar in this way, but Louisiana is a full-on life, no parole sentence. And at this rodeo, it's kind of gladiatorial. Most of the convicts have had no experience riding, broncos, let alone bulls, but they volunteer for it because it's the one chance that they get to be seen by the public. Otherwise, they're kind of invisible for the rest of their lives. Anyway, I was so moved by this event and by all the paradoxes that I just wrote a letter to Harper's Magazine, which was pretty prominent at the time. They said, sure, go write about it. And that then led to my first book. So that was like, a year and a half of spending a week or 2 weeks at the prison, and then lots of time, communicating with wardens and guards and more with the inmates and the inmates' families. So it's really, for me, a slow process. Same with Speedo. So, no, I wasn't really worried about getting sued. Just about getting the story right, about being faithful. Here's the tricky thing. It's not about getting sued. It's that I've got to do two things. I've got to be faithful to the person's story, and yet I've got to sculpt it. Our stories are all full of meaning. I guarantee you every person in this room would have enough narrative material for a book, but it's a question of shaping it. And there's art involved, and there's chances to be taken. Like, what if my decisions as a sculptor don't match up with the way Speedo perceives himself, or the way other people perceived him? I'm fortunate enough that really hasn't happened yet, but that's where more of the danger comes, is making sure that my shaping brings meaning out of the story of the person that I'm writing about. Yeah.
Two questions. One about process. You said this started out as a magazine article. How long did it take you to know that it was a book and not just a magazine article? And then second question is, toward the end of the book, you talk about the way that opera has gone from principle of voice to more of an appearance. And with that, do you see opportunities for African Americans increasing in opera because they're very limited and have been very limited through the years?
Right.
And I know that we have a relative who got hired with the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra through a blind audition, but the performers can't do blind auditions.
Right. Great question. So I'd say a few months to do the magazine story, followed by about a year of conversations between Speedo and me, and that was the point at which I was sure about the book. I mean, I was increasingly sure during that year, but I wanted to make sure he was comfortable. I wanted to make sure there was just enough there. Of course, in the end, that turned out to be way more than enough. Now, it is true that people say that opera is becoming more and more concerned about the performer's looks, when once it was an art form concerned solely with the precision, the layers, and of course, the power of the voice. You know, this is a subtle point. It's not as though the voice is being displaced, but there is a change going on. One of the ways, I know some of you will probably, go see the Met in HD over the coming weeks, and this has been a sort of revolution that Peter Gelb, the general manager of the Met, has helped to promote, and it's brought opera to many, many, many more people, millions more people than it would have reached otherwise. But of course, this means close-ups. You're no longer sitting way back just relating to that singer. You're relating to an image. An image, the primariness of it then changes what we're casting for to some degree. There are dangers in this artistically, and I suppose this could theoretically, could further impede the chances of African American singers on the opera stage, because one could argue, well, these were, 19th century and earlier compositions. Their librettists weren't thinking about, except in a few cases, weren't thinking about African American performers. When I think what Speedo would say, or what other African American singers would say, is that we African American performers still aren't quite being heard with perfectly pure ears. We're being seen as well as heard. Preconceptions are coming into play, particularly with someone like Speedo. Low voice, is it a little too raspy, not quite operatic enough, and is it too gospel-y? Again, that old stereotype. And this is what I mean about being a complicated story for our times, because it's not a story about legal segregation. It's not a story about, encoded prohibitions. But it is a story about the way we see each other. And so when Speedo walks into an audition room, the casters, because of what they see, may be hearing just a little bit differently, and that may be affecting whether he gets a role or not. And that's why I think you're referring to those blind auditions that instrumentalists can have that singers obviously really can't. I'm hopeful. I'm always hopeful, partly because Speedo is hopeful, because he's just a hopeful human being, that this won't finally be an impediment, that his voice, that the voice of others will triumph. But as with everything we're up against right now, I think it's important to hold two things at once. One is the sort of intransigence, the persistence of those impediments, and the other is, the progress we've made, and the fact that with the devotion that Speedo was willing to invest, tremendous accomplishments can be had.
Could you kindly talk about the story of how the profits from this book are being shared? Thank you.
Interesting. I've never gotten that question before. I'm going to be a little bit private about that, but I will say that, this is one of these rare cases. Well, actually, let me back up. So there's a kind of long-standing ethical rule, anyway, in journalism that one should never share any money with the subject because it could corrupt the story, right? Subject creates more drama in order to create better story. On the other hand, and you can look back at this, a friend of mine, John Tierney, who writes for the Times, said about 10 years ago, he kind of changed the thinking on this bit, maybe it was 15 years ago. It's really weird because we're valuing these stories and yet acknowledging no value when it comes to the people we're writing about. And sometimes the people we're writing about, often the people we're writing about, are in really dire straits. So with that, I'm not going to answer your question specifically, but I am going to say, I was conscious of that and tried to deal with that as best I could without breaking those serious ethical edicts, which do protect against just trumped up stories, which I wanted to be really careful about avoiding, because Speedo's story in its raw, untrumped up form, to me, was unforgettable, and I hope it will be or has been unforgettable for you. Thank you. Thank you.